First of all, we wouldn't be talking election reform, nominating reforms at the level that we are without Count My Vote having pursued their agenda. I'm concerned with the Count My Vote agenda. I don't believe that simply moving to direct primaries will increase citizen participation. And it was citizen participation that was the stated intent of election reforms. I've asked the National Conference of State Legislatures, I serve as their National Vice President, I've asked them to provide, as soon as they can, data on not only the voter turnout, but drilling down a little bit deeper. Because it appears that most states that have a single party dominance and that have direct primaries, that their voter participation, Utah is in the middle of that pack. It doesn't look like making this change would increase voter participation. So we came forward with a proposal based on the negotiations between Count My Vote and the Republican Party. But it didn't stop there with just the two items that Count My Vote was asking for. Senate Bill 54 goes further towards citizen participation. So if the objective is truly making greater opportunities for citizens to participate in the process, I believe Senate Bill 54 goes much further in that direction than simply going to a direct primary. So what do I think? I think that it's we have a process. The process is both the citizens' initiatives and the legislature. There is no guarantee that Count My Vote will have the signatures, or if they get the signatures, that the initiative would pass in November. There's broad support for reform in our process. That's why I brought forward the bill, and thus far there's been widespread acceptance in the legislature.
And outside the legislature, I know there's been, I read in the paper over the weekend, I think LeVar Webb and Frank Pignanelli weighed in on this issue. So there's, I think, some very positive comments on us addressing this and doing so in a very public and deliberative way.
Now, we did, as, I don't know, President, if you've mentioned this, I made a motion today on the floor to have a time certain on the debate for Senate Bill 54 on Thursday morning at 11 o'clock. Last week, when I was in this room in this press conference, or press availability, there was a press release from Count My Vote. They didn't show up at the committee. They didn't weigh in. They claimed in a quote in the media that they didn't because we wouldn't have changed anything to begin with. The facts are that last October, I met with the principals of Count My Vote, asked them to join me in crafting a compromise piece of legislation that I believe the legislature would pass. They declined then. They declined to come to the committee. They then claimed that somehow Senate Bill 54 was akin to House Bill 477, the grandma debacle that came up late in the session, was rushed through, and that no one had a chance to weigh in, to debate, to contemplate the provisions. This concept was first reported in the media last October. There have been numerous media articles between then and now. Senate Bill 54 was actually released publicly the first part of February. It's been out for at least 2 weeks. It passed unanimously in committee after appropriate public notice. And now we're giving the public notice of when the debate will be on the floor of the Senate so that they'll have a chance to tune in, to come up, to weigh in. Because we are very anxious to have the greatest level of transparency on this issue that we can.
Any other questions on this issue?
Will the convention threshold, will that be adjusted on the floor, do you believe, on Thursday?
Mr. Hissman, there's a process up here. Any legislator can propose any amendment. I've made the case for why those 4 provisions will increase voter participation. Today there was an article that said that these don't go far enough and that the people want something more, and yet the very author of that was supporting Count My Vote's proposed settlement with the Republican Party that didn't go nearly as far as 54. So this seems to be somewhat situational.
So I assume you could expect there to be an amendment.
Our process allows any legislator to offer any amendment, and then we have a debate on it.
But we don't know of anybody that's planning on it this time, but we don't know.
Senator Valentine mentioned a potential amendment in committee. My plan is to resist amendments to the bill, although I understand that there is some concern about the 2-day window. There may be some consideration of having absentee voting at the caucus and a 2-day window, but having that 2-day window be 2 days leading up to caucus night rather than after the full slate of delegate nominees is identified. So you could have early voting and still have nominations from the floor. There's been some in the Republican Party that have requested an amendment of that nature. But that's going to be our process, to have a very thorough, robust, and very public debate of our electoral process. And to those who say that the legislature shouldn't be creating laws about how we get elected, all election provisions currently exist in state statute. They're the product of the legislative process.
Well, the easiest process for me as an incumbent would be to go to a straight primary.
Well, I mentioned this last week.
That'd be the easiest, but I don't believe in that. I believe that it ought to be hard. I believe that I ought to face some hard questions, and that process is through the convention system.
You know, it's ironic, President. Folks that support Count My Vote are accusing Senate Bill 54 of being incumbent protectionism. Folks that oppose Count My Vote claim that Count My Vote is incumbent protectionism. So you've got folks saying 54 is protectionism and Count My Vote is protectionism for incumbents. In my own case, if the provisions of 54 were in place as early as 2004, I would have been in a primary in 2004, 2008, and 2012. As an incumbent, I concur. I believe that an open primary, a direct primary in my district would be probably easier than some of the battles I've had in my own reelection within the Republican Party, based on immigration and some of our other policy considerations.
It's easier for me to raise money. I have name recognition in my Senate district. A direct primary empowers that. It doesn't. I've been through this process a number of times and recognize over the years that having a convention system where you really have to get down and meet the people, it gives the common person an opportunity to run. You know, I hate to see that being done away with.
I'd like to mention one other thing that is troubling on this whole process. When Count My Vote held their town hall meetings throughout the state, they were proposing something far different than what's in the initiative. They were proposing a dual track. Keep the caucus convention system, have an alternative path to the ballot. That's not what the initiative is. Throughout our law, throughout our code, there are many provisions where in statute we say this is an exclusive remedy. For example, if you're injured in the workplace and that your employer has workers' compensation coverage, the sole remedy is workers' compensation. And we have that in tax law. And throughout our code, there are areas where the statutorily there is an exclusive remedy or an exclusive alternative. If Count My Vote had intended there to be no other alternative, they could have put that in their initiative, and they chose not to. If they wanted an alternative path to the ballot, they had a great debate, but what they told me last week in a meeting in my office, or in a meeting in the Senate Rules Room, was that their donors demanded something different. Not what the people are wanting, but what their donors were demanding. So this notion that somehow 54 is circumventing their will, somehow it's undermining the will, they could have drafted their initiative differently that would have precluded the legislature being able to provide any alternative, and they chose not to. And a discussion for the interim that hasn't been on the radar screen, and that is the online voting. There are two bills. Currently we have online voting. It's limited for military ADA. That will be expanded at the request of the Elections Office. I'm carrying that bill, and a new representative, Representative Cox, will be the House sponsor. Then Representative Cox is bringing forward a bill for online voting for the presidential primary in 2016 as a test run for online voting being expanded more generally in our electoral process. That was part of the original concept when I spoke with the folks with Count My Vote, but it was too complex to put that in Senate Bill 54, so we have two companion bills on online voting, And then Representative Rebecca Chavez-Houck and I will be bringing forward further discussion on using technology for initiative signatures this interim. So those components are out there as well.
So any other questions on this issue?
You mentioned Utah's kind of in the middle of the pack when it comes to voter turnout with all the states that are heavily dominated by one party. I'm wondering, is it about that, or is it more about just open access, having better access to candidates earlier in the process? Is that more the point of Count My Vote?
You'd have to ask Count My Vote. The reality is today, any qualified citizen can file for office. They can file as an unaffiliated voter. It takes 1,000 signatures to get on a ballot in a statewide race as an unaffiliated voter. It takes 300 signatures for a legislative seat. That is open access to the ballot for anyone that chooses to file for office if they meet the constitutional requirements. And any citizen that is a registered voter would have the ability to vote for that individual. That's not what this debate is about. This debate is about whether an individual can place their name on the ballot, identified as a party candidate, without having had any interaction with the party's requirements to carry the party banner going into the election. That's what this is about. It's not about open access. We already have that. Without the initiative and without Senate Bill 54, any qualified citizen qualified under the Constitution for office based on age and residency and other requirements can file for office. They would be an unaffiliated voter in the general election. But if they want to carry the banner of party affiliation, that's the question here. What level of involvement should the party have in that process? And frankly, it would appear that Count My Vote is trying to circumvent any party interaction at all. They're claiming some right to run with party affiliation without meeting any of the criteria that the party would impose.
Could you comment
We'll take one more question, so this will be it.
on the contention that Count My Vote would lead away from the extremes, that caucus system helps more right-wing or more left-wing people?
Well, John Huntsman came out of the caucus system, and he was one of the most moderates during that cycle. And you can go down the list. Nolan Karras came out of that cycle. You can look at historically, that's a difficult case to make, but one of the concerns about the direct primary, Lee, is plurality. If you have a fringe candidate that has a very strong following of 10 or 15 or 20% of the electorate, and by the way, Count My Vote does nothing to allow unaffiliated voters to vote in a primary. Senate Bill 54 does. But there's a concern if you had 10 candidates, and we've seen 10 candidates in the congressional races, in the governor's race. If you had one more extreme candidate, but they had a very strong following, you can actually make the case that a direct primary could likely, through plurality, give rise to that more extreme candidate surviving the primary, because they have a much more passionate base, albeit a smaller base, and the other candidate splitting the more mainstream vote. We've seen that in other states.